本集节目由永丰金控冠名赞助，翻转金融，共创美好生活，以新闻开启国际视野。永丰金控与您一同掌握全球脉动。大家好，欢迎收听联合开炮，我是郭崇伦。我们今天要来谈一本书，就是《中国任务：美国驻华记者的口述史》。这是南加州大学12集纪录片的一个延伸，超过了100个人的美国记者的访谈记录，他们绝大部分都是派遣到中国的外籍记者。作者齐迈可先生曾经担任过首任的 Cnn 的北京分社社长，也是台湾非常熟悉的少数外国记者。他同时也是被访谈的对象之一。我们今天请齐迈可先生来谈这本书，以及他所感受到他在中国的点点滴滴。Mr. Chinoy, thank you for being on the show.
谢谢 Thank you.
Let me begin by asking you, can you explain for us what's the purpose of this documentary and extending into a book project? Do you believe that the project would inspire more young journalism to devote their coverage of China?
Well, when you think about how most people get their information about China, it's from the media. It's from newspapers, radio, television, magazines. But most people who consume news don't have any real idea of how the news they're consuming actually got there. Most consumers of news have no understanding or appreciation of what goes into the reporting, the writing, the transmission, the dissemination of news. And yet, as someone who was a foreign correspondent for over 30 years, and as anybody who is in or around the news business knows, the process has a huge impact on the final product. The decisions that people make about where to go, who to talk to, how they get their information, the circumstances under which they have to organize it and put it together really shapes what comes out of your television set or your radio or on your computer screen in a way that people don't have any sense of. This is true everywhere. But when it comes to China, which is an extremely important country and a very difficult country for journalists to work in, it's a country that has been very suspicious of outsiders. It has a secretive political culture. It's run by a communist party that's obsessed with controlling information and controlling the narrative. So I thought there would be real value to trying, in effect, to tell the story of the people who have told the China story for the American media. The American media has had an inordinate, sort of a disproportionate impact on shaping international perceptions of China as well as American perceptions of China, because of the power of organizations like the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN and the TV networks, the wire services. This has meant that coverage of China has not only shaped perceptions of the country in American political circles and in the American public, but it's shaped perceptions of China all over the world. So there's real value in learning who these people were, how did they get to China, how did they do their jobs, what was it like, what went into the thinking, and what did you do if you were the Life magazine correspondent in Shanghai and the Red Army is marching in 1949. What was it like trying to understand Chairman Mao's Cultural Revolution in the 1960s when you were sitting in Hong Kong and you couldn't go in? What was it like going on the press plane with Richard Nixon in 72 or opening the first American news bureaus in Beijing after normalization, or being in Tiananmen Square in 1989, or charting the rise of China? And I think the goal is to make it possible for people who read the book to become more sophisticated consumers of news so that they will themselves have a deeper appreciation of what it is that they're reading and watching and listening to about a story that is clearly one of the most important in the world.
So the book is an extension of the documentary, but those two are not really the same. Can you explain the difference?
The documentary project began in 2008, and it ended up in 12 hour-long episodes also called Assignment China, all available on the internet. And it was based on interviews with people who had covered China or who had interacted with those who'd covered China. But as often happens when you do a documentary film, lots of wonderful material doesn't make it into the film. You have limitations of time, and format, or the absence of video to go with the sound, all the things that you factor into as a documentary filmmaker. So there was lots of wonderful material that never made it into the films. And then the film series ended in 2015, and in the last 6, 7, 8 years, things have changed very dramatically in China, and the role of the press has been a central feature there. And so I thought it would be interesting to have a book version of this project, both because there's lots of stuff that is interesting that people would not otherwise be able to see, and because in more recent years there have been very, very important developments. So I see the book both as, first of all, a good read. Journalists are born storytellers, and there's a quality that we try to create in the book. It's like when I was a correspondent in the old days, you'd go out, you'd do your story, that at the end of the day, you'd go to the hotel bar and everybody would have a drink and you'd sit around and you'd talk shop. How did you get your story out today? Who did you interview? What was the scariest thing that happened? Did you have a fight with your editor? Did it end up on page 1 or page 25? And we tried to create a little bit of that quality. So it's a bit like being a bystander in a room full of some of the greatest journalists of our times, talking about how they covered one of the biggest stories of our times. But it's also for people who are interested in the role that the media plays in the making of foreign policy, for example, or how journalists do their job. If you're in an academic program studying journalism, studying international affairs, or studying China, because the journalists have, the old saying is, journalists have a front row seat to witness history. And that's really true. So to get the story of the person who was in the front row watching all of this stuff happen is very interesting. So it's both a good read and I think a really valuable resource for anybody who's interested in China or journalism or international affairs.
But if our listeners are wondering whether it's not updated, I can assure you that the book is very updated. I mean, Mr. Chinoy have covered what's happening after 2015, all the way up to all the journalists have been expelled from China, in a sense, in the late 2020, 22, 23, right? But let me ask you, the first impression when a China correspondent arrived in China is those officials, that is the handler that is meeting with them. And usually we saw from the report, those Chinese officials have the image of a stereotype of a weak, irresponsible, or even corrupt, with only some of the exception, like Zhu Rongji, as you mentioned in the book. So can you describe what kind of impression you have for the Chinese officials you met? Anyone you find it impressive, or they carry some of the general characteristic in Chinese bureaucracy?
I think the interactions with Chinese officials have been very important and often very frustrating for foreign journalists. Certainly in the old days, the supervision of journalists was very tight, and so everybody has a sort of minder at the foreign ministry that you have to deal with. And it used to be that to travel outside Beijing, you had to get permission 10 days in advance from the Waiban, the Foreign Affairs Office of the locality where you wanted to go. And if they gave you permission, then you usually had a local guide. So there are officials that interacted with journalists whose job was to sort of manage journalists. And they were a mixed bag. Some of them saw their job as trying to prevent you from doing anything that you thought was interesting. Some of them were more sympathetic. Some of them were eager to help. To some degree, the behavior of officials reflected the political climate at the time. When I first started going to China in the late 70s, it was still very early. The reforms of Deng Xiaoping were just beginning. The officials were still pretty uptight. By the time I moved there to open the CNN Beijing bureau in 1987, it was a more open atmosphere. Officials were more eager for coverage. Then you had the crisis of Tiananmen Square in 1989 and a kind of political tightening. But by the early mid-90s, the economy began to take off, and officials were eager for coverage so that you could go to a city and you could get to talk to the local party secretary or the mayor, and they would be very interested. Let me show you our new economic development plan. How can coverage on CNN help generate foreign investment? So people were quite enthusiastic. And like any society with that many people, there were and are some extremely smart officials in the Chinese system. That's one reason why the system has survived all these years. But there's a separate level, which is sort of high-level leadership. And there, access as a journalist has always been extremely challenging.
Right.
The foreign ministry has a weekly, when I started there, it was a weekly briefing. Now it's a daily briefing, which was helpful for getting the party line, but wasn't often helpful for getting a lot more information. The spokesmen there were just as smooth as a spokesman.
Or usually stonewall against a lot of issues.
They would say what their instructions allowed them to say, and they wouldn't answer anything else. Some print journalists would occasionally get off the record background lunch or coffee with a vice foreign minister or something like that. I was able to interview Jiang Zemin. After the June 4th, 1989, he did 2 television interviews in the intervening years. One was with Barbara Walters of ABC News, I think. She was working for ABC at the time. And then the second one was with CNN. And it was absolutely fascinating because I got to sit across from the leader of China and ask him questions. But it took 6 months of negotiation. They wanted all the questions in advance. He didn't say anything particularly dramatic, but I at least got to size him up face to face.
Okay. Is he saying anything off the script?
No, absolutely not. In fact, when we got to the Great Hall of the People the day before the interview to look at the setup, we discovered there was a teleprompter. Which is, a machine where the news presenter reads the script. And I said, you can't have a teleprompter. We gave you the questions because that was we don't like to give questions in advance, but we gave you the questions in advance because that's the condition of the interview. But it has to have the feel of a conversation. If he wants to use a teleprompter, he can just go on CCTV and read from a teleprompter. So in the end, they removed the teleprompter.
Okay.
But normally, you had very limited access to senior officials. And I think this is a case where the Chinese authorities hurt themselves because they complain they've always complained, and today they complain still. The Western media is biased, it's unfair, it doesn't tell China's story. But if the leaders won't go out and tell the story, then how can you complain if your positions aren't articulated clearly? And it's interesting, when you look back in history, Zhou Enlai gave some television interviews. In fact, we have in the documentary series, I found a clip of Zhou Enlai doing a filmed interview with Edgar Snow, the famous journalist who went to China in the 30s and wrote Red Star over China and was considered friendly. But Zhou Enlai sat down in front of a camera, talked to Edgar Snow. Mao would meet journalists, although usually not with cameras going. During the Nixon trip in 1972, some of the reporters that I interviewed who went with Nixon talked about Zhou Enlai coming over to them at the airport at one point during the trip, and just having a kind of very relaxed, casual exchange, talking jokes, laughing, and so on. And all of these reporters said, wow, he was so impressive. And you don't see Chinese leaders do that now. And I think they hurt themselves in a situation where they could advance their cause by being more accessible, but their system and their thinking today doesn't permit that.
You just mentioned that there's some golden age of reporting that is in the early 90s when the Chinese economy is really booming, especially in Shanghai, as you mentioned in your book. Now there's a most watched television series, Blossom Shanghai, that's very popular even in Taiwan. Do you think that from your experience, how real is the TV series to reproduce the Shanghai at that time? And I understand this is a big production. Is there any political motivation behind supporting this TV series?
Well, I have to confess that I haven't actually seen the series. I've read a lot about it. I can see why Shanghai in the mid-late 90s is a kind of attractive period, because once the economic reforms really gathered momentum after Deng Xiaoping's famous southern tour of 1992, when he went down to Shenzhen and essentially said, we have to start the economic reforms despite the political repression after the June 4th, 1989 incident. Shanghai was really at the epicenter of this explosion of economic growth. And the journalists that I interviewed for Assignment China all talked about how exciting it was to be in Shanghai in the late 90s. You had the first stock markets, you had all these entrepreneurs. There was even a journalist who ended up running a bar and a restaurant on the side, sort of taking, being swept up in this tremendous burst of entrepreneurial energy. It's kind of like the liftoff of the economic boom. One of the central engines of that was Shanghai. And so you can understand the appeal of that era. It was such an exciting time in China. The country was really taking off, and Shanghai was leading the takeoff. So to put a drama at that time is very interesting. I'll be very eager to watch it, particularly in view of the political context today, when the whole relationship of foreign investment to China and interacting with the rest of the world and getting rich rather than just thinking about ideological issues has changed. So I'm very curious to see how that's portrayed, and I'm curious to see what the censors, how they shaped it to allow evoking a period which in some respects is a period on which the Chinese leadership today has kind of turned its back a little bit.
From our previous conversation, you mentioned that you deliberately not to talk about the reporting of Taiwan and Shanghai because it will make the book too big. It's not easy to read.
Taiwan and Hong Kong.
Taiwan and Hong Kong. I'm sorry. But you know that the reporter at the time based in Beijing would travel back and forth between Taiwan and Beijing, especially there's a major election going on in Taiwan. But what I want to ask is, how much or what is the Taiwan factor would have on the Chinese society and politics? Especially what I mean is, for instance, Taiwan businessmen had involved with a lot of economic development in China. And also later on, the Taiwan factor, the separationist tendency of Taiwan had created a tremendous nationalism in China as well. How do you explain, from your experience, the Taiwan factor in China at the time?
Well, I was very lucky because I was based in China at the time when the doors really first began to open in the late 80s to the travel and contacting exchanges and trade and investment. I think particularly in the 90s when this was all new, Taiwan was seen as having a lot to offer to the mainland, particularly in terms of its economic expertise and the experience here. And Taiwan business people were welcome. I think Taiwan business people were among the earliest to sort of get back into China in the years after Tiananmen, when much of the world was shunning China. And there's no question, when you look at the sort of economic growth, that the Taiwan investment, that factories built and run by Taiwanese, had an impact in terms of helping the economy develop, helping China acquire sort of more modern techniques of doing business and running companies and so on. And that was important. And yet you have this paradox that on the one hand, Taiwan has played an important role economically and still plays an important role economically in China. And yet as Taiwan became a more full-fledged democracy, and as a sort of sense of separate Taiwan identity developed, and the Taiwan issue became, therefore, a more kind of tense and fraught issue, you have this paradox that on the one hand, while Taiwan business is welcomed and Taiwan money is welcomed and there's a lot of back and forth, you also have, particularly among the more extreme nationalistic quarters in China, people who are, take a very tough line towards Taiwan, and that exists today. You have big Taiwan businesses operating in China as they've always done, and then you have all this war talk in the headlines and so on at the same time. So it's this kind of odd paradox that the two roles kind of fight each other, but they both coexist uneasily.
Let me ask you about a particular year, which is 2012. That is the time when Xi Jinping is going to assume the position of the General Secretary of the CCP. And at the time, there's a lot of political rumors, and the Western media, especially American media, really scoop a lot of big stories at the time, like Bo Xilai's wife involvement with the murder of Haywood, the English businessman, or Xi Jinping's family or Wen Jiabao's family's fortune. To what degree do you think that those stories are the result of hard investigative reporting, or is it something that is initiated or confirmed by the political rivals of the other party being investigated?
There have always been all sorts of speculation that the exposés that came out in that year, and you're right, 2012 was an extraordinary year in terms of news from China, with Bo Xilai's wife involved in the murder of this British businessman, and then expose about the hidden wealth of the relatives of Premier Wen Jiabao, and then by David Barboza of the New York Times, and then Michael Forsyth of Bloomberg News, doing an expose about the hidden wealth of relatives of Xi Jinping. And there's a whole chapter in the book for people who are interested in which those reporters talk at great length about how they did that coverage. And there were people who said this has to have been leaks. There's no way they could have figured it out. But that's not true. The reality is that this was extremely enterprising reporting, and the reporters would hear things, they would follow things up. I think it was true, particularly with the Bo Xilai case. There was a lot of internal fighting within the leadership. And so what you had were people within the system who were willing to talk to reporters, and which is essentially what, that's kind of normal work in non-communist society. Right. You hear something, you go talk to somebody, you get another fact, you go ask somebody else about it, and eventually you put it together. And that's what they did. So the notion that there was some sort of puppet master within the system sort of deliberately leaking this for a sort of concrete political reason, I think is a very inaccurate view. So Michael Forsyth, who then worked for Bloomberg News and works for the New York Times now, he talks about how they watched the Wall Street Journal do this really excellent reporting about Bo Xilai's wife, and they thought, we're being beaten on a really big story. What can we do? So they started digging through corporate records in Hong Kong, and they discovered that because corporate records in Hong Kong were quite transparent, they were able to make links, and they discovered, oh my goodness, here's a document in the name of such and such a person. That person looks like they're a relative of the Xi Jinping. Let's go find out if that's true. And so somebody went to the house of the mother of the person who was named, and the mother said, yes, my daughter is, manages this. And for the Wen Jiabao story, David Barboza of the New York Times had been hearing, being based in Shanghai, gossip over dinner table conversations and coffee and drinks with people for a long time about corruption at high levels. And the name that kept coming back over and over were the relatives of Wen Jiabao. And he then went through publicly available corporate records. And he showed me when I was doing the research for Assignment China, he showed me this kind of spreadsheet that in which a line gets drawn from this company to that company, and then from that company to the next company, and then it all leads back to Wen Jiabao's wife. So this was just really high-level enterprise reporting, but in a political climate where, because there were differences and because there were rivalries, people were more willing to provide information. But it was just reporters rolling up their sleeves and doing the kind of job that reporters like to do.
They did the reporting and investigating in a very secret way, but in the last stage, they have to get a response from the Chinese government. And the Chinese government is putting tremendous pressure on suppressing those stories from publishing. Right. But different news corporations have different response. The New York Times would not let that kind of pressure get in the way. But the Bloomberg had really killed the stories. Why does make their reaction different?
Well, the Chinese authorities tried very hard to kill the stories about Xi Jinping's relatives at Bloomberg and the Times story about Wen Jiabao's relatives. In fairness, Bloomberg resisted the pressure, and they published the story about Xi Jinping's relatives.
Right.
But then the reporter, Forsyth, started an investigation into the man who was the head of Wanda, China's richest man. Right. And when that reporting was finished, Bloomberg killed it. And I think they killed it because Bloomberg had a big business in China selling Bloomberg News terminals. And that's really their big income. And that was not just for journalists. I mean, every business needed a Bloomberg terminal to follow market movements around the world. And I think that they were worried that they would jeopardize this business. And so they killed the story. And then when news of the story being killed leaked out, Forsyth was actually fired from Bloomberg News
for violating confidential.
Presumably, he's under a gag order, and he can't even talk about it even today. To its immense credit, the New York Times hired Bloomberg, hired Forsyth from Bloomberg, and one of the first stories that Forsyth did at the New York Times was to re-report the story that Bloomberg killed, and the Times ran it, and Forsyth has since done outstanding investigative reporting for the New York Times. But it's an interesting question where big organizations have financial interests, and the Chinese government is perfectly happy to target those financial interests. In the case of the New York Times, they had just launched a Chinese language edition of the Times, which still exists. But basically that was blocked in China, so they lost all their advertisers. So they took a big financial hit. The Times is wealthy and powerful enough that it was willing to take the hit. But Bloomberg, for a period of time, essentially kowtowed to the Chinese government. Although, in fairness, by the mid-teens, they were back, doing coverage, and Bloomberg has had a lot of good coverage since. But that is a kind of stain on Bloomberg's reputation.
Let me ask you what's happening recently. I mean, the Chinese authority had always been hostile to foreign correspondents and almost treat them as spies in a sense. But Beijing stopped issuing visas is something of a retaliation against President Trump, listing 5 Chinese news media as foreign agents. It eventually ended their stay in the United States. So who should be blamed for this tug of war in this case?
That's an interesting question. I think the Chinese authorities had been already taking actions to curtail the activities and access of journalists, foreign journalists, and foreign journalists were already having lots of visa problems. Before this mass expulsion in 2020, there were many cases of journalists either not having their visas renewed, or normally, like when I was in Beijing, you get a 1-year journalist visa. After 12 months, you'd go in and they'd stamp it again, and you'd get another 1-year visa. Journalists were getting 3-month visas, 1-month visa, very short leash to create pressure on them. So the Chinese were kind of looking for ways to constrain the press corps. Trump then took this decision to order a number of Chinese out to reduce the size of Chinese state-run media in the U.S., and the Chinese jumped on this as an excuse. I think this is a case where the Chinese came out better because in terms of they got rid of a lot of troublesome reporters who were important sources of information for the rest of the world, whereas what most of the Chinese journalists in the States were doing was little more than meaningless propaganda. And it raises a very interesting question about which there's been a great deal of debate in the States, which is the issue of reciprocity. How do you respond when China bans somebody or won't give a visa? Do you retaliate in the same way? And as I say, in this case, what happened was a bunch of people doing Chinese communist propaganda had to stop doing it in the States, and a couple of dozen very serious journalists who were doing very important work for places like the New York Times and Washington Post and Wall Street Journal were forced to leave China, significantly hurting those newspapers and significantly hurting the ability of consumers of news to get a better understanding of China. So it's an interesting question of what does that tell you about whether reciprocity in that form and how it works. But the result has been a dramatic shrinking in the size of the American press corps now. Right. The numbers are down. Organizations that had lots of journalist visas have a much smaller number of people. Mm-hmm. And again, I think that's very unfortunate, because what it means is we're getting less coverage of China, mm-hmm. and what we're especially losing sight of are the kind of deeper human interest, daily life stories. If you have a big bureau, then you can afford to send somebody mm-hmm. to spend 10 days, sit in a farm in Gansu province, and come back with 3 really good stories about what's going on in the countryside. Right. But if you've only got 1 or 2 people, you can't risk them leaving Beijing. They might miss an important statement by Xi Jinping. They might miss a foreign ministry briefing. So you're losing this kind of texture of life, the stories that humanize ordinary people in China, that make China more than just a kind of caricature of this big, powerful country. Right. And instead, the balance of the coverage has shifted so that the coverage is much more U.S.-China relations, right. U.S.-China rivalry, the Taiwan issue, right. China, Russia, Ukraine, North Korea, the South China Sea. But you've got 1.3 billion people who are living their lives, who are not spending all day worrying about the Taiwan issue or Russia or Ukraine, who have families and hopes and dreams and tragedies and aspirations. And we're not getting the same sense of that. And so we're missing something very important in the kind of the texture of Chinese society, because there aren't enough journalists able to get out and around enough to do that. And again, this is a case where we outside China as consumers of news lose. And yet again, China loses, because they like to talk about tell China's story well, but if you can't sort of dig in and talk about the ordinary people because you're too busy doing the foreign ministry press conference as your daily bread and butter work, you just the circumstances make it much harder to do. So China loses as well. So it's a lose-lose proposition to not have those journalists there in those numbers.
So you're suggesting that to focus only on those breaking news or the rivalry between China and the United States, that it would lean toward the negative reporting, as China would not like to see.
In an odd sort of way, when the focus is on the great power competition and China taking a more assertive role in the world and the U.S. pushing back, or debates about military preparedness in Taiwan or what China is doing in the South China Sea, that's really important news. That has to be covered.
Right.
I'm not for minutes suggesting it shouldn't be covered. It needs coverage. But if that takes up 80%,
right,
and daily life of ordinary people, what are ordinary Chinese saying, doing, thinking about the things that matter to them? If that's only 10% or 20%, as opposed to 50% and 50%, you get a kind of imbalanced picture. And so I wonder there may well be very interesting issues and trends and themes and cross currents in Chinese society that we really don't have any good sense of, because the reporters aren't there, and it's a huge country and it's a complicated country. And if you're not there to get a sense of it, then you're missing something that's potentially very important that could affect China's economic development. It could affect Chinese politics, could affect Chinese behavior in all sorts of ways. And we may simply not know because there's just not enough people on the ground getting enough access.
This situation you just described is under the context of there's a tension between China and the United States. But since November last year, there seemed to be an easing of situation between after the meeting between Biden and Xi Jinping. Do you think that now is the good time that first Beijing will welcome those foreign correspondents back to China, and those foreign correspondents and their news organization would be willing to send them back to China?
I think most news organizations who have the resources would jump at the chance to send people to China. It's kind of odd to me. This is not a hard concession for Beijing to make, to give another half dozen or 10 visas to American journalists. They control them, carefully enough in China that they're not taking much of a risk. And it's a bit surprising to me that they haven't been willing to do that. It's an easy give that wins you some points with the Americans at minimal cost. But they haven't been willing to do it, and I think it's partly a reflection of the climate in China and this fixation on control. I think it's true that the Biden-Xi meeting did lower the temperature a little bit, and that both of them, I think, realized that they need each for their own interests for this to not spiral into a crisis. I don't think it resolved any of the deeper, more fundamental differences. I think China is also waiting to see what happens with the U.S. Election, because I think they're rooting very much for Trump to win, because I think they see Biden has kept some of Trump's very tough policies, but unlike Trump, he's managed it in a competent, skillful, intelligent way, because Biden is a competent, skillful, intelligent guy, and Trump is an idiot and a fool, and not capable of sort of managing it properly. And even though I think Trump will be happy to bash China in all sorts of ways, I think there's a sort of lack of coherence about it. He'll alienate American allies. So I think the Chinese see it as in their interest to have Trump as president. So while waiting to see how the American political system plays out, it makes a great deal of sense for China to be a bit more restrained in its behavior.
Lastly, I want to ask you, a lot of journalists, after they cannot get visa extended in China, they move to Taiwan. So you mentioned that now Taiwan is more like Hong Kong in the 50s and 60s, that as a listening post or watching basis over what's happening in China. But there seem to be still some differences. So what are the similarities and what are the differences? Now Taiwan is acting as a base for foreign journalists learning about China.
One of the consequences of the mass expulsion of American journalists in 2020 from China is that quite a number ended up coming to Taiwan. And when, with the national security law imposed on Hong Kong, it's become harder to work in Hong Kong.
Right.
Either journalists who've had to leave China can't get visas for Hong Kong, or people in Hong Kong are afraid to talk. And so there's a certain logic in having people here, and there are quite a lot of people who either were kicked out or who are waiting for visas for China who are here now. I think in general that's very good for Taiwan because it means that the island gets more coverage just kind of in its own right. And Taiwan's a hugely important economic player. It's a society of 23 million people, a lot of interesting stuff happening. So it's good for Taiwan that it gets more coverage. As a base to cover China, it's mixed, I would say. On the one hand, it's a Chinese-speaking society. Everybody, to one degree or another, kind of thinks about China. There's a lot of back and forth. There are people who follow China here, so there is expertise. On the other hand, I think there's a bit of a risk that the lens through which everything here is viewed in relation to China is the cross-straits Taiwan-China issue lens. And so if you're writing about that, it's great. But if you really want to know about, what's going on in agriculture in Anhui province, I'm not sure that this is that great a place. But the same tools that people who watch China from Taiwan are using can also be used in Seoul or in Washington, and that's the Chinese internet and WeChat and Weibo and making phone calls and so on. And I mean, in an odd kind of way, the arc of my book, Assignment China, it begins with the communist victory in the Chinese Civil War and the journalists having to leave China. And then you have 30 years almost of journalists sitting outside China trying to put the pieces together without being able to go. And then you have this opening up, and it gets more and more open, and then it starts getting less and less open. And now today, it hasn't completely, but it's sort of come almost full circle. Right. And you're back again to a situation, several decades after the beginning of the book, where yet again you have reporters sitting here. And I talk. Some of the journalists I talked to remembered there was a legendary figure in Hong Kong who I also knew and I remember, named Father Laszlo Ladany. Mm-hmm. Father Ladany was a Jesuit priest who had been in China in the 1940s, and he spoke fluent Chinese. And from the 1950s to the 1980s, he published a weekly newsletter called the China News Analysis. And this was Father Ladany reading what was in the Chinese press, listening to Chinese radio broadcasts, looking at documents, and then just writing his analysis based on this. And I kind of say, not completely as a joke, but those of us who are trying to do China now have to dust off our inner Father Ladany and use some of those same tools, augmented by things like the internet, by commercially available satellite imagery, by the things that you have now that Father Ladany in his day didn't have. But it's a challenge, and what you don't get is just, you can't feel it and smell it and taste it and touch it. And so you miss important stuff no matter how hard you work and how much you use these other tools. You still miss something important. But I think the China watchers of the 50s and 60s and 70s showed you can still do a competent job on sort of getting the big political picture right. And I think the challenge is to try and do that again today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chinoy, for sharing your thought on what's happening in China, and also in your book, The Assignment China, 中国任务，美国驻华记者的口述史. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
谢谢各位收听，我们下次见。
上网搜寻 VIP.UDN.com 到联合报数位版看更多精彩的报道。